I
Okay,
love it.
welcome everyone. Welcome to our class today. This is Learn to Knit with Marley Bird. My name is Jenny Bowden. I am joined today by our friend and knitting expert Marley Bird for our Learn to Knit class. This is a 1-hour class. We will be taking a short break in the middle. We are recording today's event, so if you need a refresher, if you want to look back at something tomorrow, if you need to slow something down, we will email you a link to the recording this time tomorrow. So if you could please keep yourselves on mute while we're recording, that will help cut down on the background noise. If you have any questions as we're going, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom. You should see a little chat bubble that says Q&A. I will be keeping an eye on that. The chat is all, but that moves so quickly, it's kind of hard to keep up with that sometimes, and your question might get missed if you post it in the chat. So please use the Q&A if you have any questions. I will, let Marley do her thing, but if there's an urgent question, I will interrupt as needed to get your question answered for you. Like I said, my name is Jenny. I work at Fave Crafts. We are sponsored today by our friends at I Like Knitting, which is a digital knitting magazine I will tell you more about in just a second. So Marley, I'm gonna kind of hand it over to you real quick if you want to go to the next screen.
All right.
I can go over real quick this digital magazine from I Like Knitting. So they're our company sponsor today. It is a digital magazine that publishes 6 times a year. Normally it's $47.64, but we do have an introductory offer for you guys today for 75% off the retail value. You can get a 1-year subscription for just $11.88. The URL here at the bottom, I can post it. Hi, Linda. I can put it in the chat as well. ilikeknitting.com/knitting75 will get you 75% off. You also get access to all of the back issues as well. So you not only do you get, the hundreds of patterns that are publishing this year, but you get access to all of the back issues. So just hundreds and hundreds of wonderful tech edited patterns, all different skill levels, high quality photos, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's our little spiel about I Like Knitting. It's a great deal if you guys are just learning to knit and want some new inspiration and patterns to try out. I am done talking for now. I'm going to pass it over to Marley. So sit back, relax, try not to get overwhelmed as we're going today. Whether you're a brand new knitter or just here to kind of refresh your skills. It's a new skill, and if you've never knit before, it might be confusing, it might be overwhelming, but just be patient with yourself. Practice makes perfect, and Marley will give you all of the tips and tricks that she knows how to master knitting and get started on the knitting journey today. So have fun, everyone, and I'm
Awesome.
any questions.
Sweet. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Jenny. She is absolutely correct. That's actually one of my number one rules for all of you out there is as we venture into this knitting, whether this is the first time you've picked it up, or maybe it's the first time in a long time you've picked it up, I want you to be patient and kind to yourself. Very rarely in life do we pick up something and we're immediately like spectacular at it. We need to be cognizant that we are teaching ourselves new skills, and we need to create those new neural pathways for our brain to our hands to do what our eyes are telling them to do. And so we just got to be patient, and practice does make perfect. So Jenny did introduce me. My name is Marley Bird. I am a Stitch ambassador for Yarnspirations Yarn. I also host and teach on the Marley Bird YouTube channel. I have marleybird.com, where you'll find patterns there for knitting and crochet, both free and paid for. And then I've written several different books. I've done some classes with Fave Crafts, and you name it, I've been doing it for a long time. I love teaching new knitters and new crocheters. So this is exciting for me to be on here once again, teaching a knitting 101 class. Now, in today's class, I'm going to teach you some key things. And is this everything you can learn in knitting? Absolutely not. But after today's class, with the knowledge you learn in today's class, could you actually make something? Totally. Like you could call yourself a knitter after today's class. All right. So we're going to learn how to cast on, and that's where we put stitches on our needles so that we can begin to work with them. We're going to learn to knit, and then we're going to learn to bind off. That's where you would finish the stitches so that they don't unravel. In between there, I'm also going to show you how to add a new ball of yarn, which is also a way to change colors. But because chances are you're going to want to add a new ball of yarn, or maybe have a knot in your yarn, have to rejoin, I need you to know how to do that. And if there's a chance for me to teach you how to fix common mistakes, I'm going to teach you those as well. Just a quick reminder, this is getting recorded, so I will be going through, I'm not going to say quickly, but I will be going through at a relatively good pace, knowing that at some point in time, you can come back and rewatch the class. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the same thing over and over and over, and we never get through the entire curriculum. So I just remind you that ask your questions, but if there's a chance that I can move on without having to go back and knowing that you can rewatch, we will do that. All right, so first things first, we are going to be using just some basic knitting needles today. And I think I have a pair of size 8s. No, I have size 9 knitting needles. It really doesn't matter what you have. If you have 7s, that's fine, 8s, 9s. And it doesn't matter if you have circulars, these are circular needles, or if you have straight needles, okay? And here's why. If you are using straight needles, the only difference between these and the circulars is that the circulars have a cord attaching the bottom. You see what I mean? If I added a cord to the bottom of these straights, just joining from that one over to this one, I'd have a pair of circulars. So all that means is that I can use my circular needles as straights. I don't have to use them in the round, and they are easier on my wrist. They aren't going to click on my tabletop, and they just in general are more commonly used in my experience. So I'm using circular needles, and I'm using a basic worsted weight yarn. And all that means is the weight of the yarn is a little bit thicker. It's not like a sock weight yarn. It's called worsted, or a 4-ply yarn, or an Aran weight yarn. Some people call it Aran weight. Just so that way you can see the stitches, and everything is going to be worked on. I'm going to use the English method, or the throwing method today, to show you how to knit. And that's where you would hold the yarn with your right hand. There's also the continental method, which is where you hold the yarn with your left hand. And that's actually part of the knitting class package that Jenny was talking about earlier, where there are 3 different classes I'm teaching this next month, and one of them is continental knitting. So I'll be showing how to knit, but holding it with your left hand, which is great if you're a crocheter, by the way. Okay, so with that, we're going to jump in and we're going to learn how to cast on. And that's just a fancy way of saying we're going to get some stitches put on these needles so that way we can begin to work a piece of fabric. All right. Okay, I'm going to switch to my hands. Oh, look at her. She is so quick. Okay, so we're going to learn how to do the knitted cast on. And the reason I start with the knitted cast on for beginners is because it's a really great transition into actual knitting. So the first thing we're going to do is begin with a slip knot. Now, if you're familiar with a slip knot, go ahead and make one. But if you're not, here's how you would do it. Take the tail of your yarn and put it in the palm of your hand. Take your working yarn, wrap it around your forefinger and your middle finger. And when you come back up, cross that over. Now rotate your hand over, go underneath this first strand and grab that second strand and pull it off. Take your fingers out. And if you keep pulling, you'll see you'll create that knot there. And if I separate the tail with the yarn that's attached to like the working yarn, if I do this, you can see that loop gets smaller and eventually it can pop and go away. But we're going to put that on our needle here. So here we go. Tail of the yarn in your working hand. I'm sorry. Tail of the yarn in the palm of your hand. Working yarn around your forefinger and middle finger. And when you come back up, cross over. Rotate your hand. Go underneath the front loop. Grab the back loop and pull it off. So you can see I have the tail here and the working yarn. I'm just pulling them and it creates this little slip knot there. And this loop here, this is really big, but that's okay. Because once I put that on my needle and I separate these 2 legs, you can see that that tightens it up to the needle. Now I don't want it to be super duper tight. I just want it to be tight enough where it's the same size as the needle. Can you all see that? It's the same size as the needle. It's not too loose. It's not like that size, right? That's bigger than the needle. And it's not so tight that I can't even like move it on my needle. It has to be just that just real comfortable. It moves along the needle and it's the same size. Okay. Okay. We're not going to use our tail anymore. So we're going to tuck that tail aside. And just a quick note, you always want to make sure your tail is about 4 to 6 inches long. Don't make your tail to where it's only like that long, because you'll never be able to weave in your end very well. Always make your tail at least 4 to 6 inches. Once you've done that, take the needle with your slip knot on it and place this needle in your left hand. Now, unlike crochet, this slip knot counts as a stitch. In crochet, anything that is on your hook does not count as a stitch, but in knitting, that does count as a stitch. So this would be considered one stitch is already cast on. And now we're going to do the next one. So here's what we're going to do. I have my right hand needle in my right hand, my left hand needle over here. You can see my pointer finger is holding on to that stitch. So it doesn't go anywhere, right? And I don't have it down here at the tip of the needle. I have it up here at this barrel of the needle, okay? I'm gonna go ahead, take my right hand needle, and if I were to set my needles like this, I'm gonna go from left to right. So I'm gonna go from the left side of that loop, go into it, and go to the right. Now, you can see when I did that, I scooted this down to the tip of my needle so that way I could get more room. You see that? So I went from left to right. I'm going to grasp both needles with my left hand, and I have my yarn over here in my right hand. Now I'm holding my yarn in a particular way that's comfortable to me, but for right now, you guys, I want you just to hold the yarn in some way that's comfortable for you. Okay, we can discuss how to hold the yarn later. Right now, I just want you to find some way that's comfortable. Once you have this yarn over here, we're going to go around the needle that we just put into that stitch. So we're going to go around the needle just like that. I didn't go over top of the needle like this, right? I went around the needle. Now our goal is to take this yarn we just wrapped around that needle and pull it through that loop we went into. So to do that, you can see I came back here. I'm grasping my right hand needle now. I'm back over here. I have my left hand needle and I'm keeping tension on this yarn. Don't forget to give yourself some grace, you guys. This is a little bit tricky. All I want to do now is my right hand needle. I'm going to just scoop it through that loop. You see that? I'm just going to scoop it through. I'm going to do that all again. I'm going to go from left to right into the stitch. Grasp my needles. Take my working yarn, wrap it around that right hand needle. Now my ultimate goal here is to take that wrap and pull it through that loop. So I'm just going to grasp the needle, make sure I have some tension on this loop, and pull it through the loop that was originally on my left hand needle. Once it's through there, I extend, and here's the trick. With my left hand needle, I'm going to swivel and scoop up that stitch. Once I get 2 stitches now on my left hand needle, I do all that again. So I'm going to show you how to do this again. Even if you're on the first one, this is the same thing. I'm going to go into the second stitch now from left to right into the stitch, around the needle, out the stitch, extend, swivel, and scoop. From left to right into that first stitch that's closest to the tip of the left hand needle, around the needle, out the stitch, extend, swivel, and scoop. In, around, out, extend, swivel, and scoop. In, around, out, extend, swivel, and scoop. Now this swivel and scoop is very important because by doing that, you're twisting the bottom of the stitch just ever so slightly, and it just makes for a better finish. So make sure you're doing the swivel and scoop, okay? So you're in, around, out, extend, swivel, and scoop. So see how I'm going underneath. Do not just dip, okay? We're not doing the dip. We're going swivel to go underneath and scooping it up. We want to scoop, not a dip. Out, extend, swivel, and scoop. Now you notice as I'm making these, I'm gradually using this finger to push them back onto the needle as each one is made. I'm not letting them congregate down here for all the, each time that one is made, because the size of these stitches is determined by this size of your needle. So watch this. When I go in, notice I bring, so I'm all the way down here to this barrel of the needle. I yarn over and I come out and I make sure that that stitch that I just created comes to the barrel of the needle again. So I make sure it's that size, right? I don't keep it down there because it would be too small. I want to make sure it's this size. Then I extend, swivel and scoop. And when I tighten this stitch up, it's now tightened up to that size of the needle. And the only time that your stitches here are the size of them is determined by your left-hand needle is on a cast on. All the other times it's not at all. It's all determined by your right-hand needle. But when you're casting on, we want to make sure they're the same size as this needle. So you want to make sure they're not down here at the tapered edge, but they're up here at the barrel size or the actual needle portion of your needle. So in, around, out, extend, swivel, and scoop. In, around, out, extend, swivel, and scoop. All right, keep doing that. I'm going to pause here for a minute and see if there are any questions, just to make sure everybody's good. And I know that you are probably working really hard and you don't have time to ask a question or type it out, but I just keep doing this. Go in, around, out, extend, swivel, scoop.
Marley, I feel like people that are joining us today have maybe knitted before because we have no questions.
That, or they are so focused on their needles
true.
and afraid to let go.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do this just for a couple more times. And the good news here, oh, I grabbed it with my other hand. The good news here is that this entire motion here is very similar to actual knitting. So when we transfer to actually knitting into these stitches, you're going to see there isn't a very big difference at all. So it's going to be good. Okay. As you're knitting along, you really do want to make sure you're controlling those stitches. Make sure you keep control of the stitches and don't let them fall off too early or get too close to the tip. You notice I always keep my finger there just to control them just ever so slightly. All right. So here we go.
Holly said she is slipping off the needle for some of the stitches.
Okay. Yeah. So the biggest thing, you do want to make sure that they're down here onto this size of the needle or this portion of the needle. And you don't get to control many things in your life. So just control when those stitches get to move up and down your needle. Just control them with your fingers. Okay.
Anne says, what if I feel like crying? Then Anne, you just power through.
Yes, you're doing just fine. Guys, I will tell you 100%, when I first started to knit, I threw my knitting across the room because I was so frustrated. So when I tell you I've been there, I have been there. You literally just have to give yourself some patience. It's going to take a little bit of time for your hands to do this movement. I get it. I make it look super easy, but I've been doing this for 25 years, right? I mean, I've been doing this for so long now that it is easy for me because my hands, they pick up needles and they know exactly what to do. But you've never picked up needles before, or maybe you haven't picked them up in a long time. Your hands need to remember or be taught how to do this movement. And you might be very intelligent. You might be some sort of like a Harvard graduate with some huge IQ and pick up your needles and be like, why can I not get this? Well, it's because you've literally never done it before. You know what I mean? You've never done it. So as much as your brain is telling your hands, hey, silly, just wrap that yarn around that needle and pull it through, your hands are like, they're playing in the sand, right? They're just like, da da da, I don't care. I don't want to do that. You have to just train them to do that. All right, I really don't care how many stitches you have on your needles at this point. Hopefully you have at least 10. We're gonna move on to actual knitting, okay? So just so you guys know, this is called a knitted cast on, and there are many different cast ons in knitting. So this is just one of many cast ons you could learn. Okay, so there are a lot of other cast ons out there, but this is the first one I teach beginner knitters because it's a very good transition into actual knitting. You're going to see what I mean. Now that we have stitches on our needle, this is our fabric that we can begin to start working into. If you're a crocheter, this is like we just did a bunch of chains and now we get to work into our chains. Okay, so right here, we're going to go into this first stitch, just like we've been doing all along, okay? So we're gonna go into it from left to right. We're gonna go around our right hand needle, just like before. We're gonna come out the stitch, just like before, except this time, you guys, we're not going to extend, swivel, and scoop because we don't wanna put this stitch that we just created on there, because now we're going to build this stitch on top of these. So the stitch that you went into on your left-hand needle, we're going to let it drop off. All right. So this is where you're going to scooch them forward and let that stitch you went into drop off. So now your stitch over here you just created is on your right-hand needle. So now not only do we have to control our stitches over here on the left, we have to control these here on the right. We don't want them to fall off. So I'm going to go into the next stitch on my left, yarn around my right-hand needle, come out. Notice how I always shove them back down here onto this needle. I don't keep them up here on my tip. And I'm going to let the stitch I went into on my left jump off. When you do this, you guys, I do not want you to take your needles and separate them like this. Okay, do not do this. We want our stitches nice and snug together, just like this. We want them sort of in this comfortable sort of cross position. We don't ever want them like this. And once you get this stitch over here, we don't want to take this and yank up our yarn. Okay, we don't want to do this. See how that pulls up the stitch from below? It makes it up and it makes the actual stitch you've created really short and narrow just by doing that. You do not want to do that. You want to keep this nice and relaxed. Just make sure that the stitch you created is the same size as your needle you're using and you'll be good. I tend to use my thumb to hold those stitches. They don't go anywhere because I do have to, they have to come down to the point so I can get my point into the next one. See what I mean? So I'm going to go in, around, out, off, in, around, out, off, in, around, out, off. See how this is so similar to the cast on you did? So it's a very good transition. In, around, out, off, in, around, out, off. I'm just going to keep going here. I think I saw somebody mentioned earlier that going around your needle is different than in crochet. You're absolutely right. In crochet, you actually wrap your hook the opposite direction than in knitting.
Bobby is asking, what do we do if one slips off before we can wrap it?
All right, so if she's talking about like you come in here and it comes off like that, okay, where it slipped off, but it's on your right hand needle, I want you to take your left hand needle, go into it from right to left, and put it back on your left hand needle. Okay, so if this happened, if you went into it and before you could wrap this, it kind of slipped off and it slipped over to your right hand needle, we want to put it back on your left hand needle. But if we put it back just like this, like if we went tip to tip and just put it on, see how it lays differently? We don't want that. We actually want it to lay this way. So in order to get that, to do that, you have to go from right to left to put it back on. If that's what she means. If she means it comes off like that, well, you have to find it to be able to get it back on, and which can be very difficult for a beginner. But if she means just it slips off onto the right hand needle, simply put it back over to the left and then restart. I don't know if that answered the question or not. Hopefully it did. It's off of both needles. So it fell off just like that. That can be tricky because if you can see right there, so mine fell off and it's like, well, where is it? Like that can be very tricky. I know because I've been knitting and crocheting, I know that that's my stitch right there. Like it looks like there's 3 loops. There's one here, one there, and then one in the middle. And I know it's that top one. So I know I can pick it up and just put it on. If you are struggling and can't find it, then the best thing, I mean, it's going to be awful. I'm sorry, but you have to restart and recast on the stitches. I just kind of goes back to reiterating how important it is to make sure you really try and control those stitches from falling off too early. And if they fell off this one time, oh, good, Bobby found it. Don't let it discourage you, Bobby. Even if it happens again and again and again, at one point in time, it's all going to just click together like the matrix, you guys. And it really does. One day you're going to be like, oh, look, I'm just knitting and I don't even have to think about it. Okay, so I got to the end of my row. I don't know if you guys noticed what happened here. I got to the end of my row. And so now all my stitches are on my right hand needle. So I need to take this needle and put it into my left hand. So that way it's like I've turned my work. And then whenever I do that here at the beginning, I just make sure that the bottom of my work, so all the row I just knit off of, it's all just pointing down. I don't like it when like my yarn is kind of all fluffed around like that, where it looks like it's like twisting around my needle. I just make sure it's all nice and flat. And I make sure that I can see the purl bump. These bumps right there, those bumps on my needle. You see those bumps? Those are purl bumps. And you might be like, well, Marley, we just knit. Why are you looking at purl bumps? The reason is the backside of a knit is a purl. So when I turned my work, I am now looking at purl bumps. Think of it this way. I'm going to put this a quarter. I just finished knitting. So I'm looking at this side, and this would be as if I'm looking at heads. Okay, this would be as if I'm looking at heads. Without turning my work, if I said to you, hey, look at my work from this side, what would you see on the other side of the heads of this quarter? You would see a tails, right? You guys all know you'd see a tails. And that's just like if I'm looking at my knits on this side, I know that if I'm looking on the back side, looking up, I'm going to see purls because the back side of a knit is a purl. So when I take my knitting and I put it into my left hand, it's like I'm turning my quarter too. So now I'm looking at tails and I'm looking at my purls. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so the backside of a knit is a purl. That's why you're looking at those purl bumps, even though you just knit. And that's because we just turned our work. So we're looking at the backside of the row we just did. Now I make sure I see all my purl bumps so that way I can recognize them. And this is going to be the first introduction to a common mistake that knitters make, especially beginner knitters. But I'll get to the end of the row here, and maybe this last stitch here is a little bit loose. So what they'll do is they'll take their yarn and they'll be like, oh, I need to tighten that up. And they pull up on the yarn like that. And they're like, oh, that looks so much better. That's nice and tidy. But what else does that look like? It looks like there are 2 stitches there, right? where we know there was only one, but now it looks like there are two. So then they'll go into it and they'll treat each one of those little loops, what look like loops, as a stitch. And all of a sudden, instead of like 10 stitches, they have 11. Okay. So what you'd have done when you do this is, I want you to notice, see the purl bump right there? When you take your yarn and you pull it up to tighten that stitch, you really are pulling up the stitch below. So this here is the stitch below the one you just knit. And so that purl bump there, you're pulling it up and it gives the illusion of 2 stitches where we don't want that. So the best thing for us to do is first make sure you can see that purl bump. And this is if you're just knitting, right? If we were doing other stitches, it'd be different, but we want to see that purl bump. Bring your yarn behind your needle. So your yarn is going to be working from back here, okay? And when we go into the stitch, we want to make sure we see that purl bump and we go into the stitch that's on the needle. So just above that purl bump. Don't put your needle into the purl bump. Put it into the stitch on your needle from right or from left to right. Yarn over your needle. Pop out. Jump off. And now if you tug on your working yarn and wiggle your needle, it tightens up the stitch below. So a little wiggle and a little tug will tighten that stitch up. And that's just something to practice over time, you guys. A little wiggle and a little tug on that first stitch tightens up the row below and you don't get an extra stitch. Okay. Now we're just going to work down all of these stitches just like we did before. Make sure you don't go into that purl bump. Go into the actual stitch on your needle and knit. And as I'm doing this, you guys, I'm actually going to do just a quick little break here for a second because we're about 30 minutes in. Just keep knitting down your row, okay? Keep knitting down your row. All right, Jenny, this is you. You are on.
All right. I hope everyone is having a fun time knitting with us today. Again, one more time, I just wanted to share this great deal with the I Like Knitting digital magazine. Normally it is $47.64, but we have this introductory offer for you guys today. It's just $11.88, which is 75% off the normal price. So again, these patterns are all tech edited, which is really nice, especially if you're just learning to knit, because sometimes you get halfway through a pattern and you realize that maybe there's a mistake in it or it was written incorrectly. The nice thing about tech edited patterns is for sure going into it that the pattern's going to work and you're not going to run into any issues along the way. So there's no advertisements in these magazines. They are all digital. So it's you get them on your computer, but they're tech edited, great photos. Some of them even have video tutorials, which is super helpful. Joyce, I see that you have your hand raised. If you want to post your question in the Q&A, Joyce, that would be the best place for me to help you out, because I can't see you or hear you guys because there's so many of you joining us today, which is awesome. But yeah, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A. And I will get that answered for you. I do see a question from Beverly, which I will try to get to during this break as well. She's got a question for Marley. So Marley, I think if you want to go to one more slide real quick. Yeah. So this is the advanced knitting class bundle that I was talking about earlier. Next Tuesday is our continental knitting class. And then the following Tuesday on the 25th of May is our mitered knitting class. And then on June 1st, we are doing entrelac knitting. Marley, please correct me if I mispronounced any of those.
No, entrelac, you're good.
Great. Each class is $19.95 individually. These are 2-hour-long classes. They are advanced techniques. So you can buy each class individually for $19.99. I think it's $19.95. Or you can get the bundle class for $29.99, which is a 50% off saving. So that's really the way to go. If you're interested in one or two of these classes. They are all recorded. So if you can't make this date or time, it's the same time as today, 11 o'clock Central, on a Tuesday, every Tuesday, the next 3 Tuesdays. So if you can't make one of them, but you still want to attend, we'd still encourage you to buy the class. You will get a link to the video recording 24 hours after each class, just like today. So we are recording today's class. All of our classes are recorded. The link here at the bottom, favecrafts.eventbrite.com, is the link to see all of our upcoming classes. I think that's kind of all we have for now. So
Awesome.
Wendy's
All right.
asking real quick how long this class is. It's an hour today, Wendy. So we are about halfway through.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So I paused right here. I got to the end of that second row that I was working on, and I've turned my work, right? So once again, I just make sure the bottom of my work is pulled down. It's just a personal preference thing for me. I like to do that. It also is a reminder that as you are knitting, you're letting your work flow down your needles. So you never want to be knitting with your work facing up like this. Like I don't want to be knitting with my work facing up. I always want it to be facing down. I want it to flow down and away from my needles. Okay. So this is just one of those little reminders. Again, I know that I'm knitting every stitch. So when I turn my work, I will be looking at a row of purls, which is good. I can make sure that like maybe I didn't accidentally slip a stitch or anything's funny. Everything looks good to me. I also paused here because I wanted to show you that little wiggle and tug thing again, because I know that this is just a very common thing. So you can see here, it looks like that last stitch is just a little bit loose. So again, I am not going to take my yarn and pull it up to tighten that up. I do not want to do that. I simply want to go into it and knit it like I normally would. Okay, knit it like I normally would. Let it jump off. And once it's off, I'm going to pull on my working yarn and wiggle my needle. And what that does is, because this yarn is still attached essentially to that stitch I just worked into, because I'm just working right on top of it, it tightens up the stitch below the stitch that I just created. And it just makes it a little bit neater. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's just a little wiggle and a little tug. So I tug this and I wiggle my needle just so that it helps wiggle the yarn in place. And that's it, just a little wiggle and a little tug. Then I keep going. Again, be very cognizant to not accidentally go into your purl bump. You want to go into the actual stitch. And then we're going to keep knitting. Now I want to get at least 2 more rows here, so that way I can talk about the stitch we are creating. Because yes, this is a knit stitch, but this is actually a particular pattern. And this pattern is very common in a lot of knitting patterns out there. So those of you who are crocheters, as you know, like you could have, a single crochet pattern, a double crochet pattern, a shell pattern, a bead stitch pattern, a corner to corner pattern. Those are all a combination of stitches to create a particular pattern stitch, right? Well, in knitting, we really only have 2 stitches. We don't have single crochet, double crochet, treble crochet, double treble crochet, anything like that. We only have a knit stitch and a purl stitch for the most part, right? So what we're learning today is the knit stitch, and you can create a multitude of patterns out there with just the knit stitch. And when you are working back and forth in the knit stitch, okay, so just like we're getting to the end of this needle and then we turn our work. So this is working back and forth. We're not working in the round. Even though we have circular needles, we are not working in the round because we're turning our work each time. This particular pattern is called garter stitch. So you can create garter stitch by knitting every row and turning your work each time. Coincidentally, you can create garter stitch by purling every row and turning your work each time as well. More commonly though, you would use the knit stitch because it tends to be a little bit easier, I think. Okay. So at least that's my experience. So as I turn my work, you can see those previous rows before where I looked like I had purls. Now it looks like it's like there's a smiley face and a frowny face, a smiley face and a frowny face. And that is a ridge that is called a garter ridge. And that is created by knitting every row, or if we were purling every row, to create garter stitch. Okay, you guys see that? Garter stitch. So as I knit this next row, it's going to give me another row of ridge of garter stitch ridges on the other side. So I'm going to keep going here. Linda is asking me, when I learned to knit, did I cry and throw my knitting in front of my teacher like Jill Wright? Jill Wright was my teacher originally, and I didn't cry and throw it in front of her. I actually cried and threw it in front of my husband. And my husband, you guys, knows how incredibly competitive I am. So he was sitting there and he was watching TV. And I swear to you, he's looking at the TV and he has the remote and he's like flipping the channels like this. And he sees me throw it across the room and he's still watching the TV. And he goes, doesn't so-and-so knit? Who is like a frenemy. You guys have frenemies where they say they're your friend, but they're really not. They're just evil. So this person happened to be a frenemy. And I looked at my husband. I was like, well, that just wasn't very nice, was it? So I stomped across the room and I picked up my knitting and I sat down. I was like, I got to get this. Because in my mind, it was like, well, if so-and-so can knit, I need to be able to do this too. And from then on out, I just kept practicing. And I tell this to everybody, just one day as I was knitting along, it really was like the matrix became clear to me. It's like I could understand all of a sudden what I was doing. And it just took time and patience. And then just everything just clicked into place. And all of a sudden I wasn't like all herky jerky with my knitting and my yarn. I was very comfortable and I could actually knit without looking at it. And it just became a comfortable thing for me. So when you guys get all frustrated, if you are competitive like me, just be like, well, if so-and-so can knit, so can I. Or if you just are stubborn and just like, I'm going to do this, I get you. I feel you. All right. So I finished that row. We can take a look at this again. You can see, so here's my cast on row right down here. It's a little bit loosey goosey. And that's just because of the cast on we used, which again, I use it for beginner knitters because I think it's a very easy transition to go into knitting. Okay. So it allows you to use what you've learned to cast on to work into your actual knitting. But you can see this ridge right here. Do you see what I mean about it? It looks like a smiley face and a frowny face, a smiley face and a frowny face. So like there's a frowny face and there's a smiley face and a frowny face and a smiley face. So that's my garter stitch ridge. So what we're creating is garter stitch. And I mean, there are designers out there who have made entire careers just based off of garter stitch. So quite literally, if you never learned to purl, you could still be a knitter. You are still a knitter after today's class. Okay, you guys, see that? All right, so I'm looking at the time. I want to show you just a couple common mistakes real quick as I'm knitting this next row. We already talked about that loose stitch here at the beginning, right? So I already showed you the wiggle and tug. So I'm going to show you once again. I'm just going to knit this and I just wiggle and tug and I just tighten things up. Now, another thing that is commonly done is somebody will begin knitting and forget that their yarn is supposed to be back here behind their needles. And so what happens is they'll have their yarn, let's say it's in front of their needles here, and they go to knit and my yarn is in front of the needles. And then they come back here to wrap and they come off and they're like, oopsie daisy. I have like a loop on my needle. Like what's going on there? It's like, doesn't look like it's attached to anything. It looks like a hole. And you're just like, what's going on? Well, that is called a yarn over. And that's actually an actual stitch that we use to do lace and to do increases. But when you do it on accident, you're just increasing your stitches on accident and you're creating holes. So the first thing you could do is if you find it at this point in time, you can undo the last stitch you did. And there's a couple ways to do that. So I'm going to show you. First way is you literally will pinch the stitch that you let drop off your left-hand needle. You see it down there? You can pinch it and then let the stitch you just created come off your right-hand needle and pull it out. So see, now I have that loop. So now I make sure my yarn is behind my needle. And then I can take this loop and put it back onto my left-hand needle. Oops, and then you have all that fall out, but you don't need to do that. Anyways, can you see that? Now, if you didn't notice, the tricky part there is that you run the risk of dropping stitches. All right, so that's not my preferred way. Here's my preferred way of tinking back, which is just knit spelled backwards, okay? So let's pretend we do that yarn over again on accident. So I did my yarn over on accident. That's what that's called, is a yarn over. And I see it. I'm like, oops, look what I did. How do I undo that? Well, here's how I do it. Notice I'm pulling down on my fabric, I'm pulling on my working yarn, and I'm really extending that stitch that I let come off of my left-hand needle, that stitch right down there. We're going to call that stitch the mother, okay? Because that mother was used to create the daughter, which is the stitch that is on my right-hand needle. What I ultimately want to have happen is I want to put the mother back onto my left-hand needle and get rid of the daughter. So what I do is I take my left-hand needle, I'm going to stab it, like I'm going to dip, I'm going to stab and dip into the mother, and I'm going to let the daughter fall off my right-hand needle and go away. Now the mother is back on my left-hand needle, the daughter is gone, and I still have the yarn over here, and that's simply gone by making sure my yarn is moved to the back. Okay, so now my yarn over is gone, everything's good and ready to go. I can create that daughter again by going into the stitch, yarning around my needle, popping up and off. I no longer have that extra stitch there, and I'm good. If you find a yarn over in your work on the next row, we can still get rid of it. So I'm going to put a yarn over in on purpose here, and we're going to pretend like I don't see it. So we're going to pretend I don't see that, and I'm going to find it on the next row and show you how to get rid of it. So if you didn't put this together, the first thing is you want to make sure your yarn is in back, okay? And this stitch here that we created accidentally by having our yarn in front and then going to knit, that's called a yarn over. You will learn that eventually, but that's what that is. So if you ever come across that and you're like, oh no, I dropped a stitch, because it looks like a big hole, but then you count your stitches and you actually have one more stitch than you had, that's because you created a yarn over. You didn't drop a stitch, you just made an extra. The other thing you just learned how to do was tink, which is knit spelled backwards. I'm going to show you how to do that again. So I'm going to knit down a couple, and we're going to tink, T-I-N-K. And that's a great way to fix mistakes. And you can tink several rows, you can tink several stitches. It's all up to whatever you need to have happen. But the biggest thing here is just knowing where your needles need to go, okay? So let's say I needed to tink back several stitches. Ultimately, what we want to do is get rid of these stitches that are on the needle and put the stitches that are beneath them back on my left-hand needle, right? So I want to find the mother of each one. So I spread my fabric apart. I find the mother, which is right there. It's underneath the daughter, right? And I dip or stab into the mother, and I let the daughter fall off. Go to the next one, stab into the mother, and then let the daughter fall off. Stab into the mother, daughter falls off. Stab into the mother, daughter falls off. And you don't have to readjust, obviously, because you're taking yarn off, but then that's it. And then you can start knitting again. Okay? Make sense? So these are some quick fixes that are very handy for beginners, because these are some of the number one reasons beginners will stop knitting, is because they don't know how to fix their mistakes. Okay. Now I'm going to get to the end of this row, and I'm going to show you another one. Let's say you came across a knot in your yarn. Okay. Or you wanted to change colors, or you got to the end of your ball of yarn and you're ready to restart. First off, if you find a knot in your yarn, do not knit over top of it. Cut your yarn and rejoin, okay? Do not just knit over top of a knot in your yarn. You don't ever do that. Don't ever trust manufactured knots. As far as how to cut and rejoin, this is how you would do it. Now, I prefer to cut and rejoin at the start of a row. So let's say that you find the knot and you're halfway down. What do? Well, you tink back to the start of that row, cut your yarn, rejoin your yarn at the start of the row, and then start again. You see how this all kind of works together? And this is how you would start. Let's pretend I'm just cutting this. Okay, so I cut it. I need to start knitting again. Well, all I would do here is go into my stitch just like I did. Only this time I would wrap with my new yarn. Whether it's the same color or a different color, it doesn't matter. I just wrap around my needle with my new yarn, pop it out and off, and then I carry on, making sure you don't wrap with the tail. So the tail, I'm just going to hold it over here out of the way. Okay. Take your yarn, your yarn you're using new. And I changed colors here so you could easily see. Yarn over my right hand needle, come out and off. and you just continue on. So if this was the same color, you would never know that I joined a new ball down here. Now, does this get a little bit loose down here? Absolutely, because those things aren't tied together. You could tie them together and just tighten them up a little bit. Absolutely, you could do that. But otherwise, this is how you would join a new ball of yarn, or if you needed to cut your yarn and get started again, okay? Now, before I get down here to where this yarn over is that we're going to fix, I'm going to show you one other thing. Let's say you're knitting along and you're on circulars or on straights, it doesn't matter. And your dog is getting into something. You're like, no, don't do that. You throw your work down and you walk away and you come back. You're like, oh man, I don't remember where I was. And let's say you didn't have this second color, right? So you easily couldn't see that you had two different colors, but you pick up your work. You're like, okay, well, this looks good. And you start knitting. What's wrong here is as you pick up your needles like this, you see how my yarn is over here in my left hand needle? See that? So if I start knitting right here with my yarn in my left hand, I am going to all of a sudden start doing an extra row on top of those, forgetting about all of these. Does that make sense? So that's an actual technique called short rows, but we don't want to do that, okay? Because what that's going to do is going to create a big hole right here, and we're going to be off balance. All of a sudden, we're going to have 6 rows over here and 4 rows over here. And here's a little thing. The only way to fix that is to rip it out or tink it out to back to the problem. So the point here is that when you throw down your work, because somebody's getting into something, or maybe you have to answer the phone, or maybe you have to go to the bathroom, I don't know. When you pick up your work again to work on it, the first thing you're going to do, and you're mid-row, find where the yarn is attached to. So here it is attached to that needle, and make sure that needle is in your right hand, right? Because when you're knitting, as we knit our stitches off our left hand needle, they go onto our right hand needle. So our working yarn is going to be attached to our right hand needle. Does that make sense? So now you can put your work down midway, but just make sure you pick it up. Make sure your yarn is in your right hand, meaning your right hand needle, and you carry on. All right. So that's a very big common mistake people will make. Now I'm going to get down here and we're going to pretend we found that yarn over as we're knitting this row. We're happy-go-lucky. We're like, oh my gosh, this is looking so great. I'm not making any mistakes. I've changed colors. Marley's the best. Knitting is going to be my new number 1. This is fantastic. What the heck is that? Right? You're just like, that's it. I'm done. I give up. I'm going back to crochet, right? No, this is nothing to be worried about. You come across this, you're just like, first thing, oh my gosh, I dropped a stitch. Why is there a hole there? Well, you didn't drop a stitch. This is a yarn over. That's all that is, right? So what you can do is if you only have 1 or 2 of these in a row, what you can do is this. This is very technical, okay? So pay close attention. You ready? This stitch here, you're going to let it fall off. Wiggle your yarn a little bit, and that's it. That's the extent. That's how you're going to get rid of that yarn over. Okay. Any extra slack you have there is going to gradually get worked into the stitches on either side, and it's just going to disappear. And then you just carry on knitting. No fret. If I were to knit that yarn over, I am going to get a hole and I'm going to get an extra stitch. Otherwise, it just goes away. Just like that. Okay, so that section of the class is like the common mistakes that you can fix on your own as you're beginning to knit. Just FYI, I have an entire video on my YouTube channel on fixing mistakes, common mistakes like that you can go and rewatch several times. And it even shows you how to drop a stitch and pick it up. So there's help out there for you in Marley terms, Marleyisms that you could absolutely go find. But the next thing you need to learn in order to be a knitter is how do you finish your work? How do you bind off your work? Because at this point, if I pulled my needles out of these loops, they would all fall apart and just go away. Okay. So we need to finish them off. This is the one thing that crochet does that's differently than knitting is that crochet, they finish off their stitches each time they make one. But knitting, we're creating this big sort of grid-like fabric, and at the very end, we finish off our stitches. And it's a very simple process, and this is how it's going to go. You knit 2 stitches just like you normally would. Okay, so we're going to knit 2 stitches. So knit 1, knit 2. And it's at this point, we want the first one that we knit to jump up and over top of the second one, like a leapfrog. So you take your left-hand needle, go into that first one, and have it jump up and over that second one and fall off. So you're left with 1 stitch on your right-hand needle. Then you knit 1 more stitch from your left-hand needle, have the first stitch, the one that was left, jump up and over the second. And you knit 1 more stitch, have the first stitch, jump up and over the second. And you do this all the way to the end. I do that all the way to the end. Keep going here. And what you'll notice is obviously I don't have all these stitches on my right hand needle anymore because I'm binding them off as I go. And so it's completing the fabric. Oops, didn't pull that through. This is so different for me. I'm not usually a thrower, so continental is my preferred way. So this one takes me a little bit longer to do. That's all right. You can see here, like here's my fabric as it's getting finished. Has a nice stretch to it. All my garter stitch ridges are built in there. And when I get to the very end here, I simply just cut my yarn and pull through, and it finishes it all off. Jenny, as I'm knitting here, are there any other questions?
Yeah, we do have a few.
Okay.
They're coming in right now. One person in the chat, I forgot who it was. She was asking about, oh, Teresa, she was asking about traveling with knitting. Is there a safe way to travel with your knitting project that will keep things from slipping off the needles?
So you can use point protectors if you want. I also am a big fan of project bags by Erin Lane Bags. So I'll put all of my stuff into a project bag, and generally my stuff doesn't fall off the needles, especially when I'm using circulars, because I just push my work to the bottom of my, or not to the bottom, down to the cord, and they don't tend to fall off. But for the most part, that's really just how it is. And you can travel with knitting needles. In the United States, at least. I mean, I do it all the time. But yeah. All right. So when you get to the end here, all you would do is cut this yarn. And at the very end, you have 2 choices. You can just simply pull this last loop up and it would be done. I tend to like, you know, just pull that through and just create like a little knot there. That's a personal preference, but that's basically it. The last thing you would do then is weave in your tails, which you would choose which side is the back side of your work, and then use a tapestry needle. I prefer these bent tip tapestry needles. I think they're great. Take your tail, which is why you always want it to be 4 to 6 inches long, and you can follow essentially the path of your knitting. It's called duplicate stitch, and just tuck it in just like so, going back and forth a couple times. Once I go down a little ways, I will find where I see where I've gone, and I will actually split my yarn like this. So I'm not going through the actual fabric. I'm going through the yarn that I just did the duplicate stitch, so it's my tail, and I'll pull it through just to kind of lock it. Snip it, and your yarn is all woven in. Everything's great. Okay, so what other questions were there? Okay,
I had to unmute myself, sorry.
That's all right.
Let's see, Elizabeth is saying about the starting stitch, I read somewhere that you can just pull it without working if your stitching is really loose. Is that a good way of starting a round?
One more time?
I read somewhere that you can just pull the starting stitch. She said about the starting stitch. I read somewhere that you can just pull it without working if your stitching is really loose. Is that a good way of starting around?
I wonder if she means like pulling it out, meaning like letting the slip knot just fall off. You can actually start a project without a slip knot. It's just, that's just another way of doing it. But for the most part, I usually start with a slip knot. I wonder if that's what she means. And as far as starting in a round, I literally just start knitting in the round. I just start going in a circle. I don't do anything different.
She said yes, pulling it out is what she meant.
Okay. All right. Yeah, you can do that.
Janice, I'm not totally sure what your question is. She just said, what about splitting yarn? So I don't know.
I don't know if she means like if you're knitting and you're accidentally splitting the yarn as you're going along, you want to be very careful of that, especially if you're using pointy needles, because they tend to want to get in and split the plies of the yarn. If you find that you're doing that, that can actually accidentally increase your stitches and it ruins the integrity of the stitch. Like that point of the yarn can actually wear out. So if you find you have split yarn, I absolutely would use the tinking method to tink back to where you messed up and redo the stitch, making sure you don't split the yarn.
Yeah, she just clarified. She just said any advice on avoiding splitting it.
Oh, the biggest thing I think would be just be very careful when you're going into the stitch. Just be deliberate that you're going in. You could try different type of needles too. Like these are Chigu needles. I also have Prim needles that work really well, and they have a little bit, I'm going to call it a hook, but it's like a nub at the end. They're not right here next to me. I don't know where they are. They're in the other room. But they're good too. They tend to not split yarn very much. I wish I had them here. I should have grabbed them. But yeah, just that would be my biggest thing. And just word to the wise, some yarns out there just split worse than others. There's no rhyme or reason to it.
Beverly is asking, is there a way to convert my pattern from straight needle usage to circular needles?
There's actually no need to convert at all because you're using circulars as straights. So you don't have to make a change. Now, if you're talking about it's a circular pattern, like in the round.
Yeah, she says if I want to make hats on circular needles.
Where it's already written as a straight?
She says use straight needles. If I want to make hats on circular needles, is there a way to convert my pattern from straight needle usage to circular needles?
So there's a lot more that goes into that because if a pattern is written for straight needles, and now you want to change it for the round, you're going to have to take away the selvage stitch. And then if it's a stitch pattern that uses knits and purls, the instructions could give you the wrong side instructions for row 2 when you are working in rounds. So you would actually want to do the opposite so that you would have right side. More often than not, I would say whoever it is, you know what? Go find a pattern that's already written in the rounds because there are so many. I have many on my own website, and I know for a fact that All Free Knitting has a ton on their website. So I would just not do the brain damage of trying to convert anything. Just go find yourself a circular pattern and use that. That's what I would do.
Yeah, she did say the pattern is written for straight needles.
Yeah. So that pattern typically would have a selvage stitch that you'd have to get rid of, like probably at either end, and then you'd have to be cognizant of. I keep saying it's cognizant. That must be the word of the day. You'd have to be aware that there is a right side and wrong side to the instructions. You'd have to figure out what the designer is going as far as what's the look you're going for and what's the right side.
Okay, and one more quick question from Holly. I don't know if I totally understand it. She says, so are knots not preferred to use? Will it make it bulky? What makes it from not unraveling?
I'm assuming she means a knot at the end of the work. And so the first thing I'm going to tell you is one of the top rules in knitting is that you don't put knots in your knitting for several different reasons. One, first off, manufactured knots are not guaranteed to stay. Okay. So they have a likelihood of unraveling. So the last thing you want to do, especially if you're making like a sweater, is to have a knot in the middle of your sweater, and then it begins to rub on your skin, which is irritating. And then it could come undone and your sweater starts unraveling in the middle of your sweater, and it's just unsightly. I am not a fan of the Russian join, which you guys have probably seen a Russian join. The only reason for me is I feel like I can tell that that part of the fabric is a little bit bulkier than the other parts of the fabric. So it's not my preferred way. And as far as keeping these ends from unraveling, if you're using a wools tend to, because they have little fibers in them, they tend to grab on themselves. But then if you are working the fiber through itself several times, which is called burying in your ends, the fibers lock on themselves, very similar to a Russian join, but it's not in the fabric, it's in the tail where it's joined. And I prefer that. So believe it or not, you don't need a knot in your knitting to hold it in place. You weaving in your ends and burying your ends does the job, does the trick. Yep.
Okay. Right. Last question, Teresa said, is the method you use today called English, and which method do you prefer when you are not teaching a class?
I am a continental knitter because I was first a crocheter. So I'm more comfortable holding the yarn in my left hand. And yes, today's method, that was English. There's also flicking, where you hold the yarn in your right hand, just like your English, only you're just kind of flicking your yarn like this. There's also Portuguese, where you wrap the yarn around your neck. There is Scottish, where you hold the knitting needles underneath your armpit. There's so many different ways to knit, which is why I really hate the thing where people say, oh, you're knitting wrong. It's like, no, you're not knitting wrong, especially if you're getting the fabric correct. You're just knitting differently than the other person does. So there is no wrong way to knit.
All right. Speaking of continental knitting, we are hosting a knitting class next Tuesday, same time and place, 11 a.m. Central Time. It is a 2-hour class. That is it for today, you guys. If anyone has any additional questions, actually, Marley, if you want to go to the last slide.
Sure. All right, so that's it for me, everybody. I'm going to say hi and bye.
Thank you, Marley.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great class. So yeah, here's my email. If anyone has any questions about this class or any of our upcoming classes, feel free to email me. I know there was also a question about lace knitting, which we actually did a lace knitting class a few months ago. We don't have any planned for the near future, but we could probably work something out where, you know, you can pay for a previous class that we did a few months ago. So feel free to email me about absolutely anything. If you have a question for Marley that we didn't get to today, feel free to email me and I will get an answer for you. There's also Marley's social media channels here if you guys want to find her on the social media channels. She has a great YouTube channel with tons and tons of great videos. Favecrafts.com is another great resource for free patterns and inspiration. Also, allfreeknitting.com is another great website for you guys to check out. Plus, the I Like Knitting digital magazine is, of course, a wonderful resource. That is not a free service. It is a paid magazine subscription, but we do have a 75% off deal for you guys today. The ilikeknitting.com/knitting75. So you can get the magazine, the 1-year subscription for just $11.88, which is a great deal. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Special thanks to Marley for leading the show and teaching us all of your wonderful knitting skills. Yeah, I guess that's it for today. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Stay safe, and hopefully we will see you next time. Thank you.
Bye, guys.